My name is Tamara Kharroub. I am the Assistant Executive Director and Senior Research Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And on behalf of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., I am pleased to welcome you to this panel discussion. Today's conversation will focus on understanding the state of climate change in the Arab world in particular, and its relationship with environmental politics and conflicts in the region, whether current conflicts or potential future conflicts. We know that for decades, the scientists have been warning about the effects of climate change and the accelerated rate of global warming. The evidence points to a major role played by human activity, and specifically the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, among others. And with that, the resulting emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the air. The impacts of this alarming trend include extreme weather, severe storms, heat waves, flooding, water shortages, wildfires, erratic rainfall patterns, and the related food insecurity and rising hunger rates, and among other climate-related disasters that the scientists have been warning about. According to the World Meteorological Organization, this decade has been the warmest decade on record, with the second half of the decade being even warmer than the first. So, and we are nowhere near being on track to meet the Paris Agreement target. Many have referred to this as a climate emergency, and like with any other disaster or emergency, the poor and most vulnerable populations are most greatly affected. Now, looking at the Arab world in particular, the Middle East and North Africa region is considered especially vulnerable to climate change, and that is because of factors like already low rainfall levels, high temperatures, dry soil, and scarcity of water and natural resources. According to some reports, the MENA region could be uninhabitable before the year 2100, and that's in about 80 years, so that's not a long time. This could potentially threaten human and national security in the region, increase migration, and fuel further political crises and conflicts. To better understand these challenges, as well as the opportunities that the Arab world is facing in terms of climate change, I would like to pose three main sets of questions or overarching themes to today's discussion. First, what is the current state of climate change in the Arab world, and what are the challenges facing the region when it comes to warming temperatures, extreme weather, and emission of greenhouse gases? The second set of questions has to do with the impact in the Arab world, whether it's impact on human life and impact on the political dynamics and environmental politics playing out as a result. And what is the role of climate change in current and future conflicts? And third has to do with the response, policies and mitigation strategies undertaken by countries in the region. Are there efforts by governments and non-governmental institutions, as well as intergovernmental agencies? Are there initiatives to regulate certain industries, to promote renewable energy technologies and alternative energy sources, and so on? Is enough being done? With many countries signing and ratifying the Paris Climate Agreement, are they really committed to the target set forth by the agreement? What else should be done, and what are the policy recommendations that we can offer for countries in the region? To answer these questions, hopefully, we are very fortunate to have with us three excellent experts who have taken the time today to provide their contributions and insights and analyses. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. I will briefly introduce our panelists in speaking order, and then we will get to the discussion. First, we have Michael Mason, who is Associate Professor of Environmental Geography at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's also the Director of the Middle East Center there, and associate of the Grantham Research Institute for Climate Change and the Environment. Second, we have Zena Agha, who is a Palestinian Iraqi writer and Middle East analyst based in London. And she's a former US policy fellow at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. We also have Marwa Daoudy, assistant professor of international relations at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Marwa is also a member of the Academic Advisory Board at Arab Center, Washington, DC. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Quickly, before I turn to our speakers for today, I would like to remind the viewers, you can send in your questions at any time through the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform. If you are watching live on our website, please send in your questions by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. It would be good if you can identify yourself and affiliation and indicate to whom your question is addressed, if it's addressed to a particular person on the panel. And we'll try to take as many questions as possible. And with that, we will start this important and timely discussion. I will give each of the speakers about 13 minutes or so, and then we will take questions. First, I would like to turn to Michael. Michael, if you could give us an overview of the challenges and opportunities presented by climate change, and maybe help us understand the options, especially for countries in the Gulf region and for economies that depend on the energy sector. And if you could also address this in light of the coronavirus pandemic and its global economic impact, if you could, Michael. And if you would, yeah, go ahead.
All that in 13 minutes, yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tamara, for the, and your colleagues for the invitation to this session. I'm just going to say, I think a few general things, and there are details I'm sure we can pick up in questions. And I'm sure some of my colleagues who are going to talk shortly or after me will pick up some specifics perhaps around climate change and conflict or particular impacts in certain areas. Tamara, you've done a great job there of outlining the kind of general impacts. So I won't say there much more than, of course, Middle East, North Africa is a very heterogeneous region. So the impacts are very localized and regional across the region. There is still a great deal of uncertainty about the particular impacts as they will be received in particular countries and the region. But let's just say in terms of global projections, we are certainly, it seems, heading above 2 degrees centigrade increase in global average temperature above pre-industrial levels. 2 degrees centigrade is the threshold identified by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as a threshold to so-called dangerous climate change. And Tamara, you've eloquently mentioned some of those particular impacts in terms of rainfall reductions, extreme events, desertification, and so forth. And if we bear in mind, for example, that agriculture in MENA is 70% rain-fed dependent, so 70% of the agriculture depends on rainfall, these could be very serious impacts, okay? Having saying all that, and again, I'll be quite brief, the kind of key message from my presentation is actually a little bit counterintuitive, because my basic message is, if we're talking about food and water availability in the Middle East and North Africa, climate change is at least currently less a source of pressure than unsustainable resource governance, okay? And I'll give some examples of this. Demographic change and the nature of the political economy in MENA countries, particularly the governments. So I'll say a little bit more there. I do have a screen share. Well, I'm just going to share a couple of slides to participants where I'll focus in more on the Gulf and the particular challenges within the Gulf. Let me see if I can do this. I'm assuming you can all see that. Yes, Tamara? So the starting point, Tamara mentioned the Paris Agreement, which is the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Change Agreement, about the responses, the world response to climate change. The Paris Agreement is part of the family of treaties and declarations and agreements within the UN system. And most countries within the UNFCCC have signed up to commitments, voluntary commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including MENA states, apart from Iran, which is not a member of the Paris Agreement, although it's a member of the UNFCCC. This useful kind of graphic, which comes from a fairly recent scientific research paper, is looking at the reductions that countries are saying they will make under the Paris Agreement. And if we bear in mind that within the Paris Agreement, currently the commitments by countries are kind of not enough to avoid 2 degrees centigrade plus global warming. In fact, they're about half of what we need. I won't go into the different tables, except to say this graph, we're looking at different so-called pledge categories of countries who say they're going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And in terms of the Gulf, all the Gulf states are characterized in the bottom right-hand corner, and the size of the circles approximates the kind of absolute kind of emissions per country. Is that the Gulf states are relatively minor in terms of absolute emissions, carbon emissions and carbon equivalent overall greenhouse gas emissions. If you look on the bottom right-hand corner, you might be able to identify Saudi Arabia and UAE. Saudi Arabia's carbon emissions are about 600 million tons a year, UAE about 200, compared to China, which is like 10 billion, US 5 billion. So not absolute large amounts. However, the Gulf countries are characterized by what I call double challenge, which is they have both very high emissions per capita and also projected high emissions growth. This is an issue as we go forward. It's a particular issue as we go forward if the world regime of climate change controls starts to constrain the economic development pathways within these countries. Iran is in the top right-hand corner. Iran is not a member of the Paris Agreement, and Iran is the eighth sort of largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. However, Iran's particular transition, and it has declared an interest in transitioning to clean energy, is restricted very much by the sanctions regime in place at the moment. So the Middle East states, particularly the Gulf states, haven't made any kind of quantitative emission reduction targets. However, as Tamara said, they have committed to renewable energy, some significant commitments in renewable energy. We have the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum solar park in Dubai, at least as projected in the bottom right-hand corner. Yesterday, I heard about the announcement by a US company, Air Products and Chemicals, of plans to build a massive green hydrogen plant in northwest Saudi Arabia to produce green hydrogen, and that was announced as a 5 billion investment to produce up to 5 gigawatts of electricity from green hydrogen. So there are big investments happening. In terms of literature on this, though, the big investments are happening from the Gulf states with a high sort of sovereign wealth funds. So, for example, the Saudi investment in green sort of technology is funded through its public investment fund, which is its sovereign wealth fund. And similarly in UAE, where we have Dubai and Abu Dhabi, the sort of sovereign wealth funds investing in a major way in renewable energy. Jeannie Sowers, a US scholar who writes about this, has noticed in this climate change kind of policy making, there's a kind of absence of broader understanding of the politics of these sort of climate change commitments. And I think broadly, I've just published a paper with a colleague at LSE on climate policy integration in UAE and Oman. If anybody's interested, I can send them a copy of the paper, which is basically, although we have these significant renewable energy commitments, it seems to be, at least in terms of the sort of the wealthy Gulf states, that this green energy investment is motivated, I would say, as much by the kind of fiscal drive to increase the share of oil going to exports rather than transitioning to a clean green economy, although these countries generally have vision statements pronouncing a commitment to a move to a green sort of energy economic future. Some of the impacts, just thought I'd give you, because it's graphic and you didn't have to see the detail. Projected sea level rise, for example, for Abu Dhabi, from both 2 degrees warming, 4 degrees centigrade warming by the end of the century, with the 2 degrees on the right and the 4 degrees centigrade on the left, where you see this is significant for the Gulf states in terms of the extensive coastal infrastructure, particularly urban infrastructure. I haven't got much time, so I'll just give you also Dubai. Again, 2 degrees warming on the right, 4 degrees centigrade warming on the left. UAE is aware of these projected impacts. UAE is undertaking, and the Emirates, particular Emirates, are undertaking specific investments and strategies to try to mitigate these impacts. But at the moment, at least in terms of current investments, they would be overwhelmed by certainly by 4 degrees centigrade warming, and arguably also by a 2 degrees centigrade warming and the resultant sea level rise which results from that. So my message, which again is kind of counterintuitive given the title of the session, and I'm not saying that climate change is not significant. I'm not saying, your Commander-in-Chief, that climate change is not happening for US participants. However, I'm saying that in terms of water extraction, the major impact, the major kind of determinants of physical water scarcity are not climate change, at least not at the moment. So I've given you a slide talking about, giving you some figures for groundwater extraction in the Middle East, with large declines in groundwater reserves in Iraq, Kuwait, Syria, and Lebanon. Across the region, groundwater extraction typically exceeds the rate at which groundwater is sustainably replenished. Now, of course, this is not disconnected to climate change, because if rainfall reduces, the extent to which groundwater aquifers are replenished by rainfall is also reduced. So we have to start to make these connections. We can also talk about unregulated domestic transboundary water flows. Iran, for example, some of you might know about the quite tragic kind of decline of Lake Urmia in Iran, which is supplies 10% of the Lake Urmia basin of water resources in Iran, which since 1972, so I haven't put the date in here, since 1972, because of extensive dam building upstream, because of intense agricultural development. And interesting, this is a kind of intensification of water, which was continuous even after the Iranian Islamic Revolution. Okay, this kind of modernist paradigm of intensive water development has led to an 80% reduction in the surface area of Lake Urmia, an 80% reduction in volume. In Iraq has lost a third of its surface area of water in the last 30, 35 years. This far exceeds any impact from climate change, okay? Most of this loss of surface area of water is a result of upstream dam construction in Turkey and Iran. The Ilısu Dam in Turkey alone, which is on the right in this picture, could reduce flows into the Tigris River by over 50%. So again, just to emphasize, climate change is significant, but we must not avoid addressing and understanding the kind of major determinants of water scarcity in the region. And also, sometimes not really discussed, is demographic growth in the region. Here I've focused on the GCC and Mashrek countries. We're facing a major substantial increase in the GCC population. I'm using statistics from the UN from 2016, so probably the best kind of estimates that we have. The GCC population expected to go to 76 million by 2050. In the Mashrek countries, we're looking at a population increase from about 170 million at the moment to 300 million by 2050, although fertility rates are declining, okay? The reason this is an impact, of course, is the sheer weight of numbers, demands on resources, and associated with this is this demographic increase is associated with urbanization, increased urbanization in the region. Increased urbanization is changing the landscapes in the region into a water-intensive, water-thirsty kind of infrastructure. So those are just some key, I'll just try and stop sharing now and come back to you. I'm not sure of my timing. Am I still okay, Tamara? Have I got a chance to say anything?
You can have 1 more minute if you like.
Okay, just to conclude. So, and I don't know, maybe I can send you those slides if you want, if anybody's interested, or they can just contact me directly for those slides. So, as I said at the start, climate change is a significant kind of stress on the region. Marwa and Zena, who are talking after me, will say something perhaps about the sort of perception that climate change might be driving or at least intensifying conflict or instability in the region. So I won't talk so much about that, except to say that I think what they say about that is absolutely on the nail. But just to say that, lastly, that so climate change is significant, but if we're talking about water and food security, then we're looking at other factors. And the last factor I will mention is that physical water scarcity becomes less of a problem the more a country develops economically, because the more the country develops economically, the more it can import what we call virtual water, which is water embedded in food products from other countries. So one of the ways in which we can address increasing water scarcity, including from climate change, is economic development. And as we all know, unfortunately, many countries in the region are trapped not just in lack of development, but we're thinking about, for example, Gaza or Syria in de-development, in structural conditions which prevent any meaningful development. So I think we need to think about that political economic context. And I haven't mentioned in terms of political regimes, but perhaps we can come back to that in questions, except to say the more the regime system is authoritarian in a particular country, the less likely it has been historically to be open to responding to environmental pressures and grievances or issues addressed by the population and civil society groups, in as far as civil society groups are allowed to exist. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much, Tamara.
Thank you, Michael. And building on this issue of water scarcity, I would like to turn to Zena for the state and the impact of climate change, water politics, and the issue of climate justice in Palestine, Israel. Zena?
Thank you very much, Tamara, and thank you, Michael, for that illuminating presentation, and also for the research that you've done, a lot of which my research has been inspired by. So what I'll be using my time for is to address the environmental and political impact of climate change in Palestine, Israel in particular. I'll begin by giving an overview of the situation, some of the political challenges facing particularly Palestinian, both Palestinian Authority and Palestinian society writ large in dealing with the threat of climate change, primarily the obstacle of the occupation. And then I'll address, depending on the time remaining, water and agriculture. And then hopefully we can come to recommendations later on, and perhaps in Q&A or something. I suppose the main point that I would like to impart in the short time that I have is that although Palestinians and Israelis physically inhabit the same sort of physical terrain, Palestinians living under occupation will suffer the effects of climate change much more severely. The ongoing Israeli occupation, which is now in its 53rd year, prevents Palestinians from accessing resources and pursuing measures to support climate change adaptation, which is sort of understood as the adjustment in human or natural systems in response to the effects of climate change. This will add pressure on both water, which is already an overexploited resource, and agriculture. And I, not sort of repeat a lot of what has already been said about the effects of climate change in the region. But can you hear me all right? Okay, I'm worried my internet's a bit dodgy. The main effects in the region are going to be increased temperatures, so it'll be warmer, and decreased precipitation, there'll be less rain, all of which will create more food and water insecurity. But I think the most interesting part of this this entire situation is the political impact. So Palestine's fragmented political landscape poses perhaps the biggest challenge to coping with the climate change effects on the region. So there are three different and often contradictory, conflicting, or even warring entities which govern the territory between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. We have the Israeli government, which provides over the modern state of Israel, occupied Jerusalem, the occupied West Bank, the Golan Heights, and sort of the de facto control of Area C, and we'll see if annexation is announced, in which case they'll control a lot more. We have the Palestinian Authority, which controls areas A and B of the West Bank, and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So the differentiated political and social reality has resulted in a really imbalanced experience towards the effects of climate change, and the ability to tackle it, and the ability to produce harmonized assessments and evaluations of its effects. Because of poor data collection. I have done has focused on Palestinians living under occupation, but actually the research I would have loved to have been able to do would be to look at Palestinian population writ large, and that includes Palestinian citizens of Israel and all Palestinians living within the territory of Palestine, Israel. But because of the way that research is conducted, I could only really study Palestinians living under occupation. So my research is primarily focused on them, but I just want to sort of demonstrate that this delineation, which separates the occupied Palestinian territories and divorcing it from historic Palestine, not only has a political imperative, it also has a sort of climate change impact as well. So I won't speak too much on the sort of population increase. Michael touched on that. The same sort of trends that we see in the Gulf are also happening in Palestine, Israel. But I think it's worth addressing the effects that the Israeli occupation has on Palestinians living under occupation in order to address the effects of climate change. So the occupation is such a big risk that it's actually been categorized by the UNDP, the UN National Development Programme, as an environmental risk in its own right. And the way it manifests are there are restrictions on the free movement of peoples and goods, of course the apartheid wall, land grabs, settlement expansion, settler violence, poor Palestinian Authority leadership. All of these threaten Palestinian food and water security and concepts of climate change in the region and Palestinian vulnerability to it. There are, of course, some short-term coping mechanisms which Palestinians have been using. For instance, in Gaza, they sort of use raw sewage for agricultural irrigation or the drilling of unauthorized wells, but all of these are just delaying the inevitable disaster which will come. And often also have sort of extreme public health implications as well. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that the OPT, the Occupied Palestinian Territory, is subject to the international law of belligerent occupation. Israel, as the legal occupier, has a legal responsibility to meet the needs of the occupied population, which, according to the Hague Convention, includes the guardianship of natural resources, and the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the arbitrary destruction and appropriation of property and the destruction, removal, and disablement of civilian objects indispensable to the civilian population. So this sort of includes agricultural areas, drinking water installations, irrigation works. So from a legal perspective, the UNDP cites that the ongoing strain caused by the Israeli occupation with regards to Palestinian water and Palestinian agricultural infrastructure are, quote, prima facie breaches of international humanitarian law requiring independent investigation by the international community. Now, of course, this is a much wider point. It doesn't just apply to the climate change impacts, but also it's a much more political and sort of alarming subject than we can talk about here. But I think it's important to flag that as a really overwhelmingly an overwhelming hindrance to Palestinian adaptation efforts to climate change. And of course, there's a complete contradiction to the sort of international reputation of Israel as the bastion of green governance policy. And so there's this Janus-faced approach towards climate change in Israel, where on the one hand, they develop a lot of green technologies which are used the world over, and on the other hand, the way that they prevent Palestinians from adapting and in many cases steal a lot of the natural resources, violates international law. And before I go on to water and climate change, I just want to speak very briefly on the paradoxical role that the Palestinian Authority plays. Now, for those unfamiliar, the Palestinian Authority is a governing body in areas A and B, which are the more densely populated parts of the West Bank. They have been in power since the Oslo Accords were signed over a quarter of a century ago. But in real terms, they actually have very little power and very little bargaining abilities, both with brokers like the United States and the occupying power of Israel. So they actually have no sovereign jurisdiction over their natural resources and large swaths of its land and its territory. It can wield no political independent will over how to manage climate risks. And yet paradoxically, it's been tasked with dealing with the problem of climate change, which sort of renders the PA's adaptive efforts as insignificant and in some cases counterproductive. It's internally very poorly equipped to support long-term adaptation. It faces major governance issues with regards to climate change planning, both because of its limited capabilities and because of corruption and sort of, you know, what has ended up happening, and I think this is sort of the political ramification of climate change policy, is that the Palestinian Authority, despite not actually wielding much power, has been tasked as a body to deal with it. So there's this performance of statehood and statecraft, which in reality has absolutely no teeth. It is unable to do anything. And there's also been a sort of a discourse shift away from occupation as injustice and as breach of international law to occupation as a hazard. And so how do you mitigate, how do you manage the occupation and make it easier to work around? And climate change adaptation actually feeds into this. So in the remaining time I have, I'd like to speak briefly on the effects of water and agriculture and the way in which the Israeli occupation hinders this. So it's clear that climate change will affect most sectors of the OPT's economy, but one of the greatest casualties will be water availability and the quality of water. Fresh water, which is sort of surface and groundwater, will become more scarce as the rainfall decreases. This will make it harder to replenish aquifers during periods of high population growth, and it will increase competition for water from Palestinian agriculture, the illegal Israeli settlements, and industry. And then, of course, the reduced rainfall will make it harder to extract water and more costly. But of course, it's not an apolitical resource. The occupation strains water resources and affects areas from health to industry. Palestinians' main source of drinking water, which is stored groundwater, and Palestinians are heavily reliant on the aquifers in the West Bank. They have been subject to over-extraction and pollution in the case of Gaza. And Israel has created a very complicated bureaucracy of licensing, permits, access rights, which are entirely designed to control and selectively curtail Palestinian access to groundwater. And the bizarre thing is this is entirely legal. So according to the 1995 Oslo II Accords, which the Palestinian Authority signed onto, which of course was initially intended as a 5-year interim agreement and is still in place today, over 80% of Palestinian water reserves in the West Bank has been granted to Israel to control. The PA is now currently trying to overturn this, but it does mean that 80% of Palestinian water is under Israeli control. And in addition to that, Israel exacts water through the Joint Water Committee, the JWC, which prohibits any water-related decision from happening without Israeli approval, and so on and so forth. And so I think if I can just talk for a second on Gaza, the situation, as so many things, is so much worse in Gaza. Israel has, through the siege, which has been in place since the mid-2000s, Israel hinders any attempt to build or maintain water infrastructure, such as reservoirs. It restricts imports of fundamental building materials. The results, I mean, have really been deadly. Between 90 to 95% of the water in Gaza today is contaminated and unfit for drinking or irrigation. Contaminated water accounts for more than 20% of all the reported diseases in Gaza. It's a leading cause of child mortality. Over 12% of child deaths are attributed to contaminated water and a series of related illnesses. So all of these things combined mean that the OPT actually has some of the lowest water per capita availability in the world. and it's only 72 litres per capita per day in the West Bank and 96 in Gaza, which is less than the World Health Organization's 100-litre minimum. And just by way of contrast, I'd like to demonstrate that Israel's 600,000 illegal settlers use about 6 times more water as of 2013 than the entire Palestinian population in the West Bank, which is about 3 million people. The settlers use about 700 litres per capita per day, a lot of it for domestic use, like swimming pools, lawns, that sort of thing. And then on top of that, the destructive actions of settlers only increases Palestinian, sorry, I'm worried if you can hear some sound. I live next to train tracks, so there's a cargo train moving past this moment, which only sort of decreases Palestinian, sort of increases their vulnerability and decreases their adaptive capabilities. And of course, this has a real knock-on effect on agriculture. So the majority of Palestinian society is actually agricultural. Over 60% of the West Bank population live in villages. They're less connected to central infrastructure. They're more dependent on the surrounding area for productivity. And economically, agriculture accounts for about 11% of employment and 21% of all exports. So the effects of the occupation are staggering, both through land theft and population control. Israel's expanding settlements and settler-only roads often cut through or deliberately build in strategic locations, which include the arable lands in Area C, which are now set to be annexed. But also by controlling freedom of movement, a lot of grazing land is inaccessible to Palestinians, particularly nomadic Palestinians, the Bedouin Arabs, which results in the fact that the OPT's yield is half of neighboring Jordan, and this is entirely political reality. The complicated permit system, over 400 checkpoints or sort of flying roadblocks, the wall, all mean that Palestinian farmers actually can't access their land and have less land available. So this makes them more water insecure. There are many there are a string of recommendations which can be done, but this is really primarily a political issue. Sort of as Michael was saying, climate change is happening, but the way that governments deal with it is an entirely political manifestation. And so the sort of main message that I would like to talk, I hope that you take away from this is that despite sort of indiscriminate effects of climate change, through sheer political will and political ideology, we see in a really fragmented and stratified reaction to the effects of climate change in Palestine and Israel.
Thank you, Zena. And now I would like to invite Marwa to share her remarks, focusing on environmental and water politics, human security, and specifically the example of Syria, if I'm correct. Marwa, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Tamara, for inviting me. I'll speak briefly about Iraq as well, although Michael has already addressed that. What I want to say is, following on Michael's and Zena's presentation, it's clear to all of us that when we're discussing climate change in the MENA region, in the Middle East more specifically, it's about climate change, which is very important. It's about the impacts of climate change, which we all recognize. But if we don't contextualize these impacts, if we don't look at the state of affairs in the Middle East, and clearly we have ongoing conflicts, and Zena mentioned clearly the situation of occupation in Palestine and the role it has on the human insecurity of the Palestinian population in accessing water resources. This is a generalizable feature. And I'll just start by saying, when we think about climate change, clearly the importance of agriculture is a core issue, considering that 70% is rain-fed. It's also critical because the agricultural sector is the largest employer in many Arab countries, including Syria and Iraq, and it contributes significantly to national economies. So climate change does matter, and I want to highlight that. I believe all of the panelists today are not climate skeptics, and we're not denying the importance of climate change. But I think it needs to be related to the presence of conflict, to power dynamics, to also the mismanagement and unsustainable practices, and also the pre-existing conditions of human insecurity, which get worsened in the context of climate change and the context of uncertainty. So I'll have two, in fact, common lines here in my discussion of Syria and Iraq, is the complexity of power struggles and the ramifications of conflicts at the interstate but also intrastate levels, which were both intertwined in the case of Syria and Iraq, and their impact on water scarcity as well, and human insecurity, and the weaponization of water resources in the context of climate change, which makes scarcity even more of a threat for the civilian populations. And I will look at it as water systems which served in the situation of the Syrian conflict, for example, and in Iraq as well, as a force equalizer capable of temporarily shifting the balance of power between warring parties. Now, at the sub and intrastate level, clearly there's an issue of mismanagement of the resources. In Iraq, we know that Iraq is on the verge of environmental collapse, breakdown, and of course, climate change is an additional pressure. According to the UN, Iraq's rivers have decreased to less than a third of their normal capacity. Specifically, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are expected to decrease their discharge by a shocking 50% by 2030 compared to the 1980s level. There's also an issue of water quality, increased salinization, which makes whatever quantity available inaccessible, unusable actually. There's also the issue of state collapse, mismanagement. There are unsustainable farming practices which have very detrimental repercussions on arable lands, affecting crop rotations and land use. There's also the issue of water weaponization, where we look at Iraq clearly. I mean, overpumping, but also targeting of water infrastructures during the 1990 and 2003 wars by the US and the coalition forces. Also domestic weaponization by Saddam Hussein against the marshlands in the 1990s. And also the Kurdistan regional government exploiting its upstream position within Iraq and often threatening to reduce downstream flows to pressure Baghdad. The IS Islamic State cells have also targeted water resources and put pressure on the central government to exercise increased power. At the Syrian level, clearly, my book, I just published a book where I looked at climate change and human security in Syria. The drastic drought of 2006-2010, which was impacted by climate change clearly, and also unsustainable practices, was worsened by the mismanagement of the drought by the Syrian government at the time when it implemented neoliberal reforms, the so-called social market economy, and reversed drastically the safety nets that used to be allocated to the rural communities of the Northeast, where the most vulnerable populations in Syria were in fact made even more vulnerable to climate change. So we had a decline in groundwater levels clearly, which were already overpumped because of the easy access of small wells, digging small wells, unlicensed wells, which multiplied over the years. That led to the collapse of the agricultural sector in the Northeast, which represents, in fact, the breadbasket of Syria. And clearly that led to major migration trends across Syria, whole communities being uprooted and livelihoods being lost, which led to this ongoing narrative outside of Syria of the conflict being climate-induced. Now, clearly, what is important to note is climate change had an impact, but if you don't analyze climate change in the context of human insecurity, of unsustainable practices, of mismanaged government policies, we cannot understand what happened in the context of Syria. Now, weaponization, I think, is a crucial element because that adds to the water scarcity, that adds to the water insecurity and human insecurity. And in looking, I have a paper coming up with International Affairs where I look at water weaponization in the context of the Syrian conflict. What is interesting here, all of the interstate and intrastate levels are intertwined again, and many actors are weaponizing the water resources. The central state, the Syrian central state, the PYD, the Kurdish affiliated Democratic Union Party, and of course the Islamic State over the previous decade. So the strategies are to attack and capture large infrastructures, transforming water as a military target and a goal, cutting water, or deliberate flooding and defensive fortification. This was done also by the Syrian regime and ISIS, and I'll get to some of the details if I have time. And also the delivery or the denial of basic infrastructure generated services by the state and the non-state actors. So clearly, all armed actors have weaponized water by destroying elements of a water system, causing damage that would otherwise have been beyond the military capabilities. So water resources, the use, the channeling has become a military tool in that sense. These strategies have been used at various times. I'll give a few examples. There were deadly battles in 2013 and 2014 between regime forces and opposition groups, which have considerably damaged water plants and sewage pipelines in Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, Homs, Haba, Idlib, and Raqqa. By July 2014 already, approximately 35% of Syria's water treatment plants had ceased functioning, and they had stopped working in Aleppo and fell by 90% in Deir ez-Zor. In 2014, the Syrian government airstrikes targeted ISIS capital, so-called capital Raqqa, and destroyed the city's water plant. In March 2017, the UN Human Rights Council issued a report that accused the Syrian Air Force of purposely destroying the Fiji spring in the besieged Wadi Barada outside of Damascus on 23 December 2016. Clearly that constituted a military target because of the presence of armed group fighters, but the damage, according to the report, had a devastating impact on over 1 million civilians in both government and opposition controlled areas, deprived of regular access to water for over 1 month. Now, there's another strategy, which is flooding and supply cuts, water as an offensive tool. And during the Battle of Homs in 2012, the Syrian regime also used water access and distribution in the siege of the city to gain power over the population. In 2014, Aleppo's pumping station was destroyed, etc., etc. On the side of ISIS, the capture of large dams in Syria and Iraq was a very effective strategy to exercise, in fact, added power and to pressure local population and central governments. In 2014, ISIS flooded 22 villages and almost completely stopped the flow of water to the cities of Karbala, Najaf, Babil, and Qadisiyah, leaving millions of inhabitants without access to water. And it also displaced 40,000 people by flooding the city of Abu Ghraib and the farmlands around Baghdad. After conquering Mosul in June 2014, ISIS, in fact, briefly cut the residents' access to water and later applied the same strategy in the city of Kharroub. And on 8 August 2014, ISIS captured the Mosul Dam on the Tigris River, potentially enabling ISIS to flood Baghdad. And it has used this threat on several occasions. These dams, afterwards, ISIS also captured the Tishreen and the Euphrates, the Tabqa Dam in Syria, exercising pressure on the central government and again threatening to flood the populations if they were attacked by the US coalition later on against its forces. In August 2014, US and Kurdish forces recaptured the Mosul Dam in Iraq, and the capture of the Tabqa Dam in Syria, which is Syria's largest dam, represented an actual threat for the Syrian population in terms of electricity needs and water access as well. That was done in February 2013. It was also located 40 kilometers upstream of Raqqa, so the geopolitics of it is very important in the self-declared capital of the new so-called new Islamic State. In March 2017, there was the Tabqa battle to recapture the dam, and there ISIS also issued a warning about its imminent collapse to put the population on its side. So there was also a battle of narratives. So, and just more recently also, another actor who has been a recent weaponizer clearly is in fact Turkey after its invasion of Syria. Beginning in early 2020, earlier this year, the Turkish authorities repeatedly shut off water to 460,000 people in the Hasake governorate after seizing the Al-Aluk pumping station in its offensive against the Kurds. And in March 2020, it cut off water to 3 refugee camps in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. Just to conclude, if I have 1 more minute, Tamara, just to say this aspect of weaponization is very important to understand, to also think climate change has an added impact here, but the use of water as a strategic tool by state and non-state actors brings to the fore the need to de-weaponize and to prevent the use of these resources against civilians. There's a Geneva Hub initiative at the moment to protect civilians from the targeting of infrastructures. And again, to get back to your initial question about I answered the impacts and also the uses. What about the responses? And I think if we don't have a comprehensive intersectional approach to climate change by looking at the political context, by looking at the economic impacts, the sources of human insecurity, in addition to the environmental impacts, one cannot understand the forthcoming risks for the MENA region, for the Middle East, and for Syria and Iraq more specifically, and realizing also the conflicts are ongoing still. There is fragmentation in both countries, and the waters still are used as targets of war, impacting considerably the human security of the population. So we will need to focus on that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marwa, for this. And thanks to all three of you for these eye-opening remarks. We have quite a few questions coming in. I think I would like to start with some general questions and then get to the questions about specific countries. As all of you have mentioned, the issue of mismanagement and weaponization of resources and the political context within which climate change is occurring. Well, my question is, do we expect to see, especially that the region is dependent on agriculture, do we expect to see more conflicts in the long term? And we have a question, a related question here from John Wiggs, whether armed conflict over food and water security in the region would change how the international community and international interests would politically engage with the region, strategically or else. I would pose these questions to all three of you. I don't know who would like to start. Michael?
Sorry, I muted myself. I think Marwa's might say a bit in a minute, because she's just written a fantastic book about this in the Syrian conflict. I mean, in terms of some perceptions of the Syrian conflict as climate change induced or intensified, but we have to look at examining. I think this may not be a satisfactory answer, but the reasons for conflict in a kind of on a contextual basis, and I think it's quite difficult sometimes a bit dangerous to try to read from environmental conditions possibilities for conflict, because this is not to say that these may not intensify the environmental conditions, the grievances or the conditions which might lead to more conflict, but it's almost the other way around, in which conflict produces vulnerability. And if we think about in terms of international community response, I mean, that's the easier response, because the international community, at least in terms of the current situation, is not really concerned about reducing conflict in terms of the lives and livelihoods of the people of the region. The international community is interested in reducing conflict insofar as it impacts on the interests of those countries. Yeah. So even I think in terms of humanitarian interventions, often this is motivated by the wanting to prevent large flows of refugees or internally displaced people. I mean, it's the fact that the tragedy of the Syrian conflict is testimony to the fact that those countries which are intervening in a blatantly partisan way to promote their interests. They have no concern whatsoever with the plight of the Syrian people. Yeah, they have their own kind of ideologies and interests, and it's a tragedy of international humanitarian law at the moment that it's been so weak in the sense of not ensuring that sort of conflict situations are regulated in any way whatsoever, and that we see, for example, the use of starvation, the use of siege in Syria, starving civilian populations, the destruction of hospitals, deliberate destruction of hospitals. So the second part is, unfortunately, at the moment, I can't see any way, unless some powerful nations in the international community take leadership on these issues, and we haven't seen that in the past decade. Yeah, you will not see China intervening from a kind of humanitarian perspective. At the moment, unfortunately, we're not seeing the US intervene from a humanitarian perspective. So I think the only prospect is maybe with a different US administration in the future. But so that sounds probably a little bit pessimistic. But I go back to if you want to understand conflict, we need to look at the conditions specific to each society, each country. And of course, those include resources. But I think almost more relevant than what resources are available is who controls the resources, who controls what happens to resources, and who controls how you make value from resources. So the political economy is a place to start, not the environment.
I just wanted to say, there is a narrative now, which is about the climate security nexus. And here, discussing the impact of conflicts in the region and the interest of external actors, this is a narrative which is also constructed. And there's been a concern by external actors about climate change in the region as soon as there was a discussion of the potentiality of environmental refugees or migrants as flooding the rest of the world. And again, this is a potentially very dangerous narrative because again, we're penalizing people who have already been dispossessed of their livelihoods. And we're saying they are sources of instability. And that of course, came to the fore clearly when there was the migrants crisis in Europe, when you had refugees coming from the Mediterranean, and particularly after the Syrian conflict. So I would say, as long as we don't address the roots of these conflicts, and the point made by Michael, I agree, environmental, but also social, political, the repression, the corruption issue, the political repression, we should not, focus on the symptoms and the consequences and the fact that there's migration, but understand why is there migration and how could the migrants be helped in regaining their livelihoods. And in that sense, I think it's very important to see the narrative and the discursive dimension of it, which is stigmatizing already vulnerable populations.
Okay, thank you, Marwa. Let me get through some of those questions. There's a question about Oman from Karim Al-Gindi for Michael. You've mentioned that, well, that's what Karim is saying. You've mentioned that the GCC countries have no quantitative emission targets. Doesn't Oman have one? And there's a question about Jordan that I would also like to address to you, Michael, if you could, or maybe Marwa as well. How is water insecurity likely to shape politics in Jordan? Michael, go ahead.
I'll take the Oman one, yeah? Yeah, if you, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that, but if you look at the Paris Agreement commitment by Oman, which is its nationally determined contribution, and I know this because I just written the paper on this, there is not a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an absolute way. However, there is a commitment to control the growth, okay? So the emissions are going to keep growing, but the Oman commitment is to reduce the increase, as it were. So we're not talking about a reduction in absolute emissions, but I should give credit to Oman, at least in terms of the commitment to, I think the commitment is to reduce the growth to 2% between 2020 and 2030. Okay, thanks for the question.
Thank you. Would anyone like to answer the question about Jordan, the impact on Jordan? Marwa, maybe?
I'm not an expert on Jordan, I have to confess, but I will consider it in light of the refugee crisis and in narratives again. What I read about the Jordan water crisis, I mean, we know that Jordan has been historically very water scarce, and this has been exacerbated in the framework of the Arab-Israeli conflict, clearly, because of the battle for access to the waters of the Jordan River, clearly, which is dating back to 1948 and then 1967, clearly. But this has changed in recent years with the influx of, I mean, the last 50 years with the influx of Palestinian refugees and more recently Iraqi and Syrian refugees, where this narrative about Jordan's water scarcity is being framed as being worsened because of the influx of an alien population. And clearly, I think here again, that's part of the security the dimension that I was outlining previously about environmental migrants. There's a need to look into sustainable practices as well, water policies locally, and look at also at the broader regional context. Perhaps Jordan has also entered into a peace agreement which did not necessarily meet its own interests and could have been renegotiated, as the Palestinian Authority has been doing since a while.
Thank you, Marwa. There are a few questions about Palestine, so I think I'll turn to Zena now. A question from Petra Wieland about the impact on Gaza, which I think Zena alluded to a little bit or discussed, but more generally, the impact on the Palestinian cause. Will climate change, COVID-19, environmental degradation give rise to a new form of solidarity and with the Palestinian cause? A couple more questions. What can the population in Gaza do to help this situation? Sorry, I'm just going through the questions here real quick. From Carol Shoshani Sharfain, who's with the UN ESCWA in Beirut. She's asking about the Green Climate Fund project. And if you, Zena, it's a long question, so I don't think we have time to go through that, but I think, and I apologize for this, but if Zena, if you could address the project on water banking and adaptation of agriculture on climate change in the northern Gaza. Other questions on Palestine. Zena, does the Palestinian Authority, a question from Dr. Ian Wilkins, does the Palestinian Authority evaluate or regard the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC as a relevant international institution for Palestinians? How would you see the PA's engagement relation with these global climate governance structures? I think that's it for Palestine. Okay, a lot of questions, Zena, so I'll give you some time to get to those.
Sure, thank you, and apologies for my dodgy internet connection. I'll begin with the first question about solidarity. I mean, I get asked this question a lot when I give quotes to journalists. I think there's sort of an obsession with knowing whether this would lead to more solidarity, both within the territory, so within Palestinians and Israelis, but also international solidarity. And I think there are two very different answers according to each group. I think, you know, this, the political moment that we're in, particularly exemplified by you know, I mean, obviously the Black Lives Matter movement, but also a kind of shifting towards making Palestine a progressive issue, which is very much at the forefront of the policy conversation on Palestine in the US right now, that Palestine is a progressive cause. If you're for environmental justice, you're for Palestinian rights. If you're for, you know, racial justice, you're for Palestinian rights, and so on and so forth. We are finally starting to see the folding in of Palestine into that discourse, particularly Black Palestine solidarity, but I also think environmental justice and Palestinian rights. And I can speak anecdotally here that when I was presenting this research to policymakers in Congress, you know, I met with Deb Harland, who is a freshman representative in New Mexico, who's an indigenous woman, and she wasn't very well versed in Palestinian rights at all. But everything I was saying about water and the way that the state controls water actually resonated perfectly clearly. You know, there was this shared understanding of the way in which state practices and state violence influences and controls these resources. So I hope that what we start to see is a shift and a sort of an embracing of Palestinian rights and climate and within the climate movement globally. And so, you know, in that perspective, I really hope that there are, and I do see seeds of growth with regards to solidarity. With regards to solidarity between Israelis, who are usually left-wing Israelis, because, you know, again, environmental justice is generally more of a left-wing / progressive cause, and Palestinians, I'm less optimistic. There are initiatives. I also would caution against trying to tackle you know, in the same way, this is the sort of same dialogue, conversation around women's rights, you know, by collapsing the effects of Zionism on the effects on Palestinian and Israeli women and acting as if their womanhood is the thing that combines them, or their effects of climate change and the fact that there's going to be climate breakdown being the only thing that aligns them, without addressing the role that Zionism and political ideology actually does a real disservice to the suffering and the plight of Palestinian people. So I think with regards to that, I mean, of course, these are my personal views, but I think that there is an exciting moment for solidarity internationally with regards to the global movement for green and environmental justice. But again, it has to be situated with regard in its political context. With regards to the population in Gaza, and sorry, I hope that answered that question. I can't actually read them because I logged out and rejoined back in. With regards to the population in Gaza, as I mentioned, there have been a sort of a string of unofficial short-term fixes for dealing with climate change, particularly the effects of water. But again, they're not long-term solutions. So sort of unauthorized well digging, using raw sewage for agriculture, you know, trying to sort of offset the over extraction of the only aquifer on the coast in Gaza. But all of these things are either short-term fixes or don't really have any effect. And as far as I can tell, and from my research, the Hamas government is absolutely not looking at this as a priority by any means. I mean, you can put this down for many factors, but primarily I think they've got other things on their mind, and climate change is not the most pressing of the disasters in Palestine for them. But of course we do anticipate, you know, this is the oft quoted report by the UN, which says that Gaza will be unlivable by 2020, and you know, it is 2020 and Gaza is unlivable. So I think, you know, this is something to bear in mind. I confess I'm actually not so familiar with the water banking in North Gaza, although I'd love to read more about it, and so I don't really feel qualified to comment on that. But I do want to address the question on the Paris Accords. And I think it's actually a really good question, and I didn't get to it in my presentation, so I'm glad it was suggested. So in 2011, the PA's Environmental Quality Authority, the EQA, actually did develop a national climate adaptation strategy, which I think Michael Mason might have been involved in some way. I'm not so sure, so perhaps he might also want to speak to that. But it was with the support from the UNDP and the LSE, as well as other PA agencies. And then there was an updated version of the National Adaptation Plan in 2016. Now the updated report, which of course is the most recent one, estimates that the total cost of the proposed agriculture and water adaptation options are in excess of $3.5 billion over the next 10 years. So where this money will come from doesn't seem to be particularly clear. The report states that the PA hopes to be able to sort of secure, I think here the quote is substantial financial support from international donors, but with no, end quote, but with no clarity on who those might be. Funding to date has been very difficult to obtain, despite the fact that there's actually growing support for and recognition of Palestinian adaptive efforts. But the state of Palestine and the state of Palestine is considered to be the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, not occupied Jerusalem. Is it's recognized as a non-member state of observer state of the UN General Assembly Resolution 6719. It became a party to the UN FCCC in March 2016. It ratified the Paris Accords in April 2016, and then it submitted the National Adaptation Plan to the UN FCCC in November 2016. So there have been movements, but again, you know, the relationship between the PA and the international community does, I believe, warrant scrutiny. By applying the same metric to assess the PA and Israeli readiness as if they're sort of two sides of the same coin with regards to handling climate change, the international community actually does a real disadvantage to the Palestinian cause, because they end up normalizing the occupation instead of treating it as an abnormalizing and entirely debilitating and destabilizing structure. So what it does is, again, it goes back to that thing I was talking about earlier, which is a performance of statehood, the performance of sort of, you know, adaptability, but actually the PA can't actually do anything. So it can keep signing on to these accords and it can keep publishing reports, but until there's actually a reckoning with what the occupation is and what it looks like, these things are null.
Okay, thank you, Zena. There are a few requests.
A very, very quick thing to that.
Go ahead, Michael.
I mean, Zena's done a fantastic job with that, but Yeah, I was involved with the PA, with the early development of their climate change adaptation strategy. And just to say that was back in 2008 and 9. And the attempt to get Palestine accepted as a full party to UNFCCC was an important part of that work. In part because it gets access to funding, and it's part of a wider PA strategy to get international recognition. As Zena said, it has this problem side of the normalcy, but of appearing, kind of trying to appear as a normal state when the conditions are anything but that. Just to say, lastly, it's interesting, it took 5 or 6 years for the Palestinians to get accepted as a full party within the UNFCCC. It was opposed by, you wouldn't be surprised to know, Israel, also the US, although it was supported by the Arab League and G77, but it took some time, quite a lot of pressure and persuasion to get to the point where the Palestinians were accepted as a full party within that treaty.
Thank you, Michael, for that important addition. We have some requests for sources and papers, so I would like to ask you to email your requests to events@arabcenterdc.org, and we'll make sure to connect you with the authors or send you the sources you're asking for. Another source, I think, Carol Shoshani Sharfan, who's with the UN INSCWA, is saying it would be preferable to use regional climate modeling outputs for the Arab MENA domain. And she is recommending the Arab Climate Change Assessment Report at recard.org. Thank you for that. She's also asking for some clarifications. Let me just read her comments here. It's not clear if the panelists are arguing whether climate change and its impact on water resources is a cause of conflict, or if it's being advanced, I believe, as a conflict multiplier alongside socioeconomic and governance challenges. That's a question for the panel. I will throw in a couple of other questions just in the interest of time. Camille Amoun is asking Michael, is there an increase in salinity in Gulf's waters due to upstream dams in Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, in addition to desalination plants on its shores? And there's a question about Iraq as well. I'll just add that. How long does it take, from Abdul Wahab Al-Qassab at Arab Center, how long does it take, and I think it's asking about the timeline, how long does it take to rescue the environmental crisis in Iraq, provided that a start signal given now? Let's just get to those questions. Michael and then Marwa.
Thank you. Those are really excellent questions. Big questions as well. Just try to remember though, I mean, my short answer to it is water scarcity causing conflict? No. I mean, I can qualify that and give examples. Just, is it an intensifier of conflict? Possibly accentuates, but not, as far as I know anywhere, kind of a primary determinant of conflict, except insofar as Marwa mentioned, where it's weaponized directly. Okay, I'll just leave that as a short answer there. I can't remember the first question. What was it about the after that question? I'll deal with the questions I remember, and then you remind me. Is the increased salinization of water in Iraq? Yes, particularly I'm currently doing a project looking at water management in southern Iraq around Basra, and there's a major problem about salinization of water, of the increase in salt level by the intrusion of seawater, because the flow of freshwater flow is so reduced, and primarily, as I said, because of the upstream damming. How can you turn around the environment situation in Iraq, where Iraq is in such a serious kind of, if not complete breakdown, a serious fragile situation politically? It's very difficult, but I think if we just deal with the environmental issue or water issue restricted to that, you must have a effective transboundary agreement dealing with the Tigris and Euphrates. The only other option, which they're considering in Iraq, southern Iraq, is if we can't improve the water flow in the river, we're going to have to go to industrial scale desalination. So there's discussion, and actually it's being commissioned, a major desalination plant, because otherwise there will not be enough water. And I'm sure as participants will know, there have been protests, major protests in Basra around the water, around the health effects of lack of water, as well as general dysfunction, governance dysfunction and unemployment, which has been accentuated by the COVID-19 situation as well. Was there another question there, Tamara?
I think that covers it. There were some references to resources, so I think that covers it.
The only thing I'd say about the paper is, unfortunately, you know, the copyright things, I can't post my paper on my website. I know you can't post it on your website, but if anybody's interested, I'll be pleased to send them a copy. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Would you, Marwa or Zena, like to add anything to this?
Well, I was just...
Okay, go ahead, Zena. Sorry,
just to say very quickly, I mean, the point about the climate change being a threat multiplier, I think, warrants a bit more attention. I think there's often this perception that sort of climate change is here and then politics is here, but actually, you know, whatever pre-existing conditions exist, climate change will draw them out further. And, you know, we're seeing this, you know, I mean, Gaza is actually a prime example of that. You know, that you have the blockade, you have poor governance, you have an international occupation, you have yada yada yada, and then at the core of it you have rising sea levels on a coastal aquifer which is salinating it. And so actually what would just be a direct consequence of climate change, which is the aquifer, it becomes a sort of a huge problem for the whole enclave because of all the political implications of that. So I think it does warrant that the power of climate change as a threat multiplier is almost the same as it almost being a cause, in the way that it spins everything out to a highly politicized dimension.
Marwa?
I'll add briefly to that to say I totally agree with these perspectives. Just to say that the threat multiplier has been used a lot in the media without really specifying what type of threat, what type of multiplication. So I disagree with the fact that climate change is a source of conflict, and clearly it worsens the pre-existing conditions of insecurity, and all depends also on the type of policies that would be implemented. And I'll just give an example. A lot of the literature does quantitative analysis now to try to test this hypothesis of climate-induced conflicts. And the problem often, these quantitative studies, they look into areas or regions such as sub-Saharan Africa where you already have pre-existing conflicts. So there's an endogeneity issue here, just to confirm the link, you know, the causal link between the two. So again, I think it intersects with political context, with the economics, with the social aspects. And one should ask, why do some countries are impacted by climate change, but they don't experience conflict in that sense? So that again goes back to the political context and the policies that are implemented.
Tamara, I just forgot one of the elements, one of the questions, I think was about desalination plants and their impacts.
Right.
Just say, yes, that is a major ecological, negative ecological impact of desalination, which is a major problem in terms of the brine, the byproduct of desalination, which is pumped into the Gulf by Saudi Arabia and UAE. And if Iraq constructs a major desalination plant for Basra in southern Iraq, this will accentuate the problem. So this is not a many people talk about this as some kind of eco solution, industrial scale desalination, insofar as it's powered by fossil fuels. Even if it's powered by renewable energy, you still have that byproduct.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Let me just go through a few again. Francesco Balcastro from University of Derby is asking about the role of ideology in the mismanagement or weaponization of resources. Like he gives the example of food independence, modernity, making the desert bloom. And he's asking whether, or for example, like dams, whether these shape and inform how regimes manage change connected to climate change. He references Dr. Marwa Daoudy's book about Syria, but is asking whether this applies to other contexts. Another question is from Andrew Maciunas, I believe. What will it take to make existing actors lay down arms to address economic needs of populations of the region? I guess that's a big question, so I'll give you 1 minute each to solve the issue of the Middle East. Well, let's start with those, and then we'll see how much time we have left.
So I'll jump in on ideology, Tamara, if I may. First, hi, Francesco, and thank you for your very excellent question. Actually, I outlined ideology as a major variable in my view in terms of the conceptual framework that I developed in my book to understand climate-induced human insecurity, but also the fact that climate intersects with the other factors. And for me, ideology is replicable anywhere else. In the case of Syria, going back to the Ba'athist ideology, it was about intensive irrigation for the purpose of food security. So that was driving also the policies, constructing large dams, intensive irrigation, which had its downside, which is over pumping of groundwater, salinization, etc. So, and again, moving on, shifting abruptly to the social market economy in 2005 toward neoliberal reforms, which completely disregarded the vulnerable population, the rural communities. In my view, this aspect of ideology, we can find it everywhere else. And I read recently a paper about Yemen and water scarcity in Yemen. And I was appalled to see that food insecurity before the current conflict was also a result of the fact that the Yemeni government had incentives to buy, instead of growing its own wheat, incentives to buy the subsidized wheat produced by in America, because it was much cheaper. So they shifted their crop towards more water consumptive products such as qat traditionally, but also fruit trees, etc. So this is again food sovereignty that we hear a lot about today, or food independence is another form of ideology, which is we don't only find in the Arab world. And I think this could be clearly replicated in other cases when it comes to looking into the impacts of agricultural policies and agricultural reforms and the impact of climate change on these.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add anything to this? Michael?
If I just say something about, again, a very, very big topic, but this idea of ideology is, I think that one aspect of the ideology which is crucial here, which is shared by many countries with different political ideologies, different ethnic, religious kind of belief systems and ideologies, is this what's been called the hydraulic mission for water-intensive agriculture development, dam building, major hydraulic infrastructure. This is a very modernist ideology, and this happens all the way across the world, but it seems to be in regimes, in political regimes which tend to or completely authoritarian, this kind of hydraulic mission is something which aids the centralization of power. And so we would expect to see it, for example, you see it in Turkey, how the hydraulic infrastructure is used to centralize power. So I think that's an important part of any situation to understand, to unpick that kind of so-called hydraulic mission as it relates to other ideologies.
Thank you, and we have about 5 minutes left, so I'll go through a few more questions and then give you a chance to respond to any of those questions that you feel strongly about, but also to give maybe your concluding remarks. A couple of questions about the issue of virtual water that Michael mentioned. Hussam Hussein is asking, how can we prevent rural to urban migrations, maintaining rural development, and prevent increasing youth unemployment? How can countries shift their economies and increase job creation in other sectors? Hussam is with the University of Oxford. Ian Chalmers is asking about food as a source of water. And that's a question, I think, to Zena as well, whether know if there's any traction in Palestine, Israel to grow these foods and increase their dependence on water. If I understand the question correctly, but it's about the possibilities of food as a source of water in Palestine. The last question that I'll be able to get to, and I apologize, there are a lot of questions, in terms of what can the leaders in the region do? So just final recommendations for governments and leaders in the region to deal with these challenges that you've all mentioned, mostly political issues that you've discussed. And I'll give each one of you about a minute, if possible. Michael, would you like to start?
Well, hi Hussam, we're in Oxford. Yes, very quickly, I think the only way we can do it is rural development, ways in which you can support rural development, which values what rural development does, including particularly in terms of protection of particular ecological assets, including water and land. And we're in a major issue at the moment, a problem of not valuing properly. It doesn't just mean economically, but also socially, the importance of rural economic development. And rural economic development can be a way in which you can hopefully allow a more balanced development in societies. What can leaders do? Be prepared to listen, and more importantly, be willing to be replaced. The willingness of a leader to be replaced, the willingness to sort of be subject to a popular vote is for me the crucial thing. Yeah, and that's not just, I don't mean it as somebody pushing democracy onto countries, but I think the more societies are open and listen to their populations, the more likely we're going to have more rational decision making ecologically.
Thanks, Michael. Zena, would you like to give your concluding remarks?
Sure. So I just on the question about food as a source of water, if these conversations have been happening, I haven't been privy to them. But I also will say that the Palestinian agriculture in Palestine and what Palestinians grow is actually a very political and culturally significant, aspect as well. Olives and the derivatives in food, soap, fuel, crafts, they're a staple of Palestinian homes. And, as of 10 years ago, in 2010, olive groves comprised about 85.3% of all the trees in the occupied Palestinian territory, and the olive sector contributed 15% to the rural agricultural income. So, and then of course we know that settlers frequently torch Palestinian olive groves, and the kind of olive tree has become this symbolic and cultural motif of resistance. It holds deep symbolism for Palestinians, Palestinian identity, and the sort of Palestinian fallahi, who is of course rural, being this sort of rootedness to the land. So I mean, whether or not this is environmentally sensible or not, I think is almost by the by. The sort of the highly politicized nature of Palestine means that almost every aspect of Palestinian output has a sort of political or cultural significance, I suppose. But also, I mean, just further to leaders, the question about what can leaders do, I think one of the things, particularly in Palestine, that we're seeing, but I know anecdotally in Iraq as well, I do some work in Iraq, my mother's Iraqi, but because of poor data collection. So in Palestine, this is a really big issue, but collecting regular and high quality data is a really, really big hindrance to getting a clearer picture of what's going on. And there are these new technologies, but they're not fully implemented either because of political machinations or because of sort of inefficiency. But what it means is that we actually, one of the hardest things is getting a very clear picture of what's happening, at what rate it's happening, where it's happening, to who it's happening, particularly in a place like Palestine, which is so fragmented in terms of governance and in terms of physically, the land's physically been carved up. Getting a clear picture is almost impossible, and the way that we can do that is by encouraging leaders to invest time and money into making sure that there's open access and high level data collection.
Thank you, Zena. Marwa, you have the microphone.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Hussam, for your question. Clearly, the urban-rural divide is a crucial element here in understanding what is happening when climate change strikes. I think unemployment becomes a very crucial issue, poverty, but also corruption. And in that sense, the way to incentivize the younger generations to stay in the rural sector, because agriculture matters in the Arab world. I know internationally the mantra is we need to allocate more water to the industry, not to agriculture, but agriculture does contribute to GDP in many of the Arab countries. It's about like even 30% of the GDP often. So it is a potentially major contribution to economic development. The problem is it has to be well managed. It has to be done in a way, for example, the modernization of irrigation systems would be a way forward, which hasn't happened, for example, in the case of Syria, which would have allocated jobs for the generations and the communities that were in the northeastern part. Now, what could leaders do? Clearly fight corruption, fight poverty. This is not their priority. And again, when we talk about conflict, the post-conflict, we're not at the post-conflict level stage, although the international plans talk about post-conflict, we're not. But when we are actually trying to tackle post-conflict rebuilding and construction, in my view, the leaders, the local leaders should be given agency if they're listening to the concerns of the population, but also focusing on the human security of the populations versus the state's interest or the leader or the elite's interest. And this is a struggle looking forward, I think, unfortunately.
Thank you, Marwa. And with that, we've reached the end of our time, but this is only the beginning, and we hope to continue this conversation in the future on this very important topic. On behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C., I would like to especially thank all three of you, the speakers for today, for your time and for your excellent and insightful contributions. Thanks to the viewers as well for joining in today. We invite you all to keep in touch. Follow our work, future webinars and publications on our website, arabcenterdc.org. And we look forward to seeing you again at our future events and webinars. For now, stay safe, everyone, and thank you for joining in.
Thank you.